Good morning. Would
Good
you
morning.
like to introduce yourself?
My name is Brent Tarter. I am a retired research historian and senior editor at the Library of Virginia. I've been studying Virginia history for more than 50 years, and I have a book coming out in the winter of 2022 and 23 on the constitutional history of Virginia.
Nice. Actually, that's really interesting. So today we'll be going over the Constitution. One of the major questions is, how did the 1971 Constitution differ from the constitutions that preceded it?
The 1971 Constitution of Virginia is different in almost every respect, except for the basic structure of government. Governor in the executive, a judiciary composed of a Supreme Court and lower courts, a General Assembly, and city and county governments. The Constitution preserved those institutions as they were, but the old Constitution, which was written in 1902 and revised in 1928, was designed specifically to make it difficult or impossible for Black people to vote. This Constitution was put into effect at the time when white supremacy and Jim Crow were being solidified in state and federal law throughout much of the country, not just in the old states of the former Confederacy. And so this Constitution contained a great many provisions that were very racist in intent, including a provision in the Constitution that prohibited the education of white and Black students in the same school. The Constitution severely limited the right to vote. In fact, it disfranchised nearly all of the remaining Black voters at the beginning of the 20th century. And it also, in the process, disfranchised about half of the white male voters. By 1971, when Virginians ratified our current state constitution, the Civil Rights Movement had brought about the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and a great many other pieces of federal legislation and federal court decisions that in effect outlawed both state legislation and constitutional provisions that allowed public discrimination against anybody, really, but they're aimed at prohibiting discrimination against minority groups, particularly African Americans. Moreover, at the same time in the 1960s, the Supreme Court required that all electoral districts in the country, from school districts to county boards of supervisors, city councils, general assemblies, and House of Representatives, all be apportioned on a one person, one vote basis. It also outlawed the poll tax as a prerequisite to vote. All of those tools, the racial discrimination, the poll tax, and gerrymandered districts had worked to the advantage of slaveholders before the Civil War, of white supremacists after the Civil War, right up into the 1960s. So one of the main reasons for a new constitution was to bring Virginia's constitution into line with all of the legal and political revolutions of the civil rights period and the what we call the representation revolution of one person, one vote. Moreover, Virginians were much more numerous in 1971 than they had been in 1902. Virginians in 1902 were largely living on farms and small towns. By 1971, a majority were living in cities and suburbs. Those county governments and city governments did not have much leeway under the old Constitution to borrow money to build schools or to keep their roads up to date or for public health purposes or almost any purpose. So one of the other reasons for a new Constitution was to allow or provide in the Constitution for city and county governments to meet the needs of the new urban and suburban majorities. You know, they did roads, they did public hospitals and public health programs, police and fire department. All those things are very expensive. And the localities, just like the state government, just like the federal government, needed to be able to borrow money for capital improvement projects. So that's what brought about this Constitution. There was a committee of distinguished lawyers and politicians and law professors who prepared a draft for the Constitution. They submitted that draft to the General Assembly. The General Assembly worked it over, made some changes, made some improvements, and then submitted it to the voters in November 1970 in a ratification referendum, and the voters ratified it. Constitution went into effect on the 1st of July, 1971, and it made, in many ways, it was a major break with public policies of the past in Virginia.
Thank you. Can you speak a little to the Commission on Constitutional Revision?
Yes, the governor in 1968 appointed an 11-member Commission on Constitutional Revision. It included 2 former governors, 1 university president, 1 former university president, 1 future federal judge, 1 future judge of the Supreme Court of the United States, and 3 future judges of the state Supreme Court, as well as some politicians and a sitting member of the World Court who was on the law faculty at the University of Virginia. And they hired A.E. Dick Howard, who was also a law professor at the University of Virginia, and that same year published a very large and important book called The Road from Runnymede, The Role of Constitutionalism in American History. So Howard was perfectly suited to be the executive director of this commission. They held public meetings around the state. They sent out lawyers and law students to do about 150 very important, detailed legal analysis of points of constitutional law. They studied the constitutions of all the other states. They studied the past constitutional history of Virginia so that they could have a very, very well-informed view of every single portion of the Constitution that they wrote. It was a nonpartisan or bipartisan commission of experts, very respectable people, as I said, who did a wonderfully good job of crafting a constitution that then the governor and the General Assembly could sell to the voters of Virginia so that they could ratify it. Some states had held constitutional conventions in the 1950s and 60s to try to bring their constitutions up to date, but those were very partisan conventions, and either they didn't do very good constitution drafts or they were so openly partisan that voters refused to ratify them. And so in Virginia, they wisely selected this other method to allow people who really knew what they were doing to prepare a draft, and then the people's elected representatives in the General Assembly were responsible for molding it into its final form. It got bipartisan support.
And a very overwhelming vote in support of it, 71%, I believe.
It was, yes, it was very gratifying to the members of the convention and the legislature that the Constitution went through as easily as it did, because that does mean then that Constitution, when it was ratified, had the overwhelming support of the voters in Virginia.
So, moving on to some of our more specific topics, the Constitution of Virginia has one of the most robust educational sections in the country. Do you think this section of the Constitution has stood the test of time?
Yes, I'm very pleased with that, and I know, in fact, I know Dick Howard, who was the executive director of the 1970 Commission, and he's very pleased too. You have to remember, this is something that people tend to forget or they don't know, that in the 1950s and 1960s, it was the policy of the state government of Virginia to evade the rulings of the Supreme Court of the United States to desegregate schools. In fact, in Prince Edward County, near Farmville, the county government actually zeroed out the public schools from the budget. They effectively abolished the public school system rather than desegregate it. And then they took that tax money collected from Black and white citizens and gave it to a new white academy that allowed in only white students. Now, the Constitution that we ratified in 1971 specifically requires the state government and the county governments and the city government to provide a high quality public education to all people of school age without regard to race. So that's a very, very important thing. It not just, the previous Constitution had authorized public schools. This Constitution requires that it be the policy of the state and of the cities and counties that those schools be of high quality. So this is very, very important gain over the previous constitutions of Virginia. And it has stood the test of time, as I say. The difficulties that we have with education are not legal difficulties. They're funding difficulties and other things, but they're not matters of the law being inadequate.
So there are people that believe that the Board of Education and that their powers are being limited. Do you feel the same nature? One of the statements given during an interview that the LVA had done a while ago was that the Constitution of Amendment sets a goal in the educational section and not a mandate, which has allowed particular individuals to skirt the rules as much as they possibly can. Do you have any particular opinions about how the Board of Education currently functions versus what was set out in the Constitution?
Well, selection of members of the State Board of Education is a political process. So are the selections of members of county and city school boards. So the membership of those boards will change from decade to decade as the political character of the state changes, as the political character of each of the counties and cities change. You do have a very sound constitutional requirement, but you are having people make the policies. It's people, teachers, educators, bureaucrats, politicians, who are entrusted with the ultimate responsibility of deciding what the curriculum is and what to emphasize. That's always going to be subject to political pressures. And it's not new right now. We've always had political nature. I mean, it allows at one interval, it allows people to be in control of the schools. The people's elected representatives decide who is going to do what on the school boards. So if there's a complaint about a particular stance that the State Board of Education takes, or a county or a city school board, that's a complaint about politics more than it is about the Constitution or the law. You can't get politics out of these things. It's just not possible.
Of course. That can be said for a lot of things.
Oh, yeah.
Moving on to environmental rights. Can you speak to how limited the environmental protections in the Constitution are?
There is an article in the Constitution of 1971 that was brand new. They put it in. The Commission on Constitutional Revision suggested it, and the General Assembly approved it with no changes. I think there were no changes. I'm pretty sure I remember that. It guaranteed for the people of Virginia that it was the policy of the state government, and would always be the policy of the state government, to secure clean air and clean water for the people of Virginia, and to protect the other natural resources for the good of the people of Virginia. There was almost no state constitutional provisions of this sort in 1971. This was a very big innovation. This was, in fact, very early on in the national conservation movement. It began to gather steam in the 1960s. And there were Clean Water and Clean Air Acts that Congress passed just about this same time. So this was very, very early. This was very far-sighted of the Commission and the General Assembly. It could serve as a model for just about any state in the country that wanted to do something similar. I know that some states have now incorporated conservation provisions into their constitutions. They're not exactly modeled on the Virginia one, but the Virginia one was either the first or one of the first. And so in that respect, Virginians were way ahead of everybody else.
Thank you.
Answer your question well?
Yes. And the last thing was restoration of rights. So in the 1971 Constitution, there are several references to the inability of people who have been convicted of a felony to vote. which is a slight change to the 1902 Constitution, which listed several individual crimes in which people were not allowed to vote afterwards. Do you believe that a constitutional amendment to allow the governor to make mass restoration of rights, or do you believe that the restoration process to be automatic? There's a current debate about how and when the governor should be able to restore rights.
Right. This is a very, very important matter. I don't think people thought about it very much in 1971. There have been provisions in the Virginia Constitution since 1830 that disfranchised people who were convicted of crimes. They amplified that provision by law late in the 19th century to characterize very, very, very minor crimes as qualifying you to be disfranchised. There was an amendment to the state constitution that was ratified in the 1870s that somebody called the Chicken Thief Amendment, which meant that, if somebody stole something of almost no value, like a chicken, you'd have a lifetime sentence of disfranchisement. Well, this was aimed at Black people. They said so at the time. The white politicians of the time believed, like most of the rest of the white people at the time, that Black people were inherently dishonest and would steal if they could. So they put this in, along with the poll tax, to make it difficult for Black people to vote, to maintain white supremacy. The 1902 Constitution was just as strong. It didn't list the chickens by name, but it had the same. 1902 Constitution had the same purpose. I know from what the Commission on Constitutional Revision did at the end of the 1960s that they didn't think about this very much. They were thinking about one person, one vote. They were thinking about desegregation of schools. They were thinking about the civil rights movement. They were thinking about the environment. They were thinking about restructuring the state courts. They were thinking about, methods of financing capital projects. And this just did not come up. It has become a very big issue in the last 15 or 20 years. And as you indicated, there are proposals to allow the governor to restore voting rights en masse or by some other means. Now, the Constitution on this is not very clear. The Constitution leaves it pretty much to the General Assembly. The General Assembly could pass a law stating under what condition people who have been convicted of felonies could get their votes. They could authorize the governor to do it en masse. They could authorize an automatic process so that when someone's term is completed, that someone gets the right to vote again. You don't need a constitutional amendment on this. If you had a constitutional amendment that specified how voting rights should be restored, it would make it safer and more predictable in the future. I hope that they will do something eventually, either to change the law or the Constitution so that after people have paid the penalty for a crime, they can get their full citizenship back. There's still many, many crimes for which you can be sent to jail for a month, but they also life sentences. It's a life sentence of depriving you of part of your citizenship. It's a life sentence of disfranchisement. Nobody else does that hardly. That's pretty unusual in this country. And I don't see that it's right. We let people out after they've served their time, or we leave them alone after they've paid a fine. And we expect them to be good citizens, but we don't allow them all of the rights of citizenship. I think we need a change. I don't know precisely what that change would be. There are several alternatives, but I think a condition that is so vague and unpredictable and frankly political is not a good thing. It's not wise. It's not just. It's not good public policy to keep that large a population of people out of their full rights of citizenship and expect them then to be good citizens.
Thank you. Last question.
This is a very partisan question in some respects. But just several years ago, when Terry McAuliffe was governor, he tried to restore the voting rights of a large number of people all at once, rather than give a special declaration for each person. And the state Supreme Court said that that was not according to the wording of the state constitution, which appeared to require individual restoration acts by the governor. But I mean, McAuliffe was a Democrat, but at almost exactly the same time, Attorney General Cuccinelli, who was a Republican, was trying to get a bill through the General Assembly that would restore voting rights much more easily. So, you know, there are people who differ about this, and it becomes embedded in partisan politics, but it's not exclusively a Democratic or a Republican argument. It's a citizenship and humanitarian argument, I think.
Thank you. So for our last question, for you personally, what type of amendment would you like to see added to the Constitution?
Well, I don't know that we need many. As I say, it would be good to have a clear legal process in the Constitution for restoration of voting rights. The education portions of the Constitution are good. The environmental portions of the Constitution are good. The Constitution on the whole is one of the best state constitutions in the country. You know, the Virginians of 50 years ago should get a pat on their backs for having done a very good job. If I were going to amend the Constitution, it would be to restore voting rights in a more fair and equitable and speedy way. And I think also that I would propose a constitutional amendment to repeal an amendment that voters ratified in 2006. In 2006, Virginia voters ratified an amendment that defined marriage as between one man and one woman only, which is to say it prohibited same-sex marriage, and it also prohibited any law that allowed people to enter into civil agreements or contracts that afforded the parties the same kinds of rights as married people have. Voters ratified that in 2006. In 2014, a federal court ruled that that amendment, which prohibited same-sex marriage, violated the Constitution of the United States. The federal court stated that way back in the 1960s, the Supreme Court had ruled in a case called Loving versus Virginia that state laws that prohibit interracial marriage violated a basic human right that was protected by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The federal judge in 2014 ruled that the 2006 Virginia Amendment did exactly the same thing. That case called Bostic versus Rainey in 2014 was appealed to the Circuit Court of Appeals, which upheld it. And then it was appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, which refused to intervene. So right now we have a provision of the state constitution that violates the federal constitution. It can't be enforced. I would repeal it. But I don't see any need for structural changes, with one other possible exception, which is how we select judges in this state. Every judge in this state is elected by the General Assembly. That's not a bad thing if you think about it. You know, people's representatives are selecting the judges. But it tends to be very, very political and very partisan, because the way politics will work in a General Assembly is that a member or two or three from a city will agree on who to appoint, and if they will get that person appointed because they're going to want all the other members of the General Assembly to vote for their candidate. In order to do that, then they have to vote for the candidates that the other people nominate. So basically, you have a very small number of local politicians who are choosing who all the local judges are, and that's a very political process. And at the same time, then, you have the majority party in the General Assembly choosing all the judges of the Court of Appeals and of the state Supreme Court. Right now, in 2022, we have a divided assembly. There's a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, House of Delegates, and a Democratic Party in the Senate of Virginia, and they cannot agree. So we have vacant judgeships because the two parties are at odds with each other. The Republicans want Republican judges. The Democrats want a Democratic judge. That's a stalemate. That's bad government. So I would favor a constitutional amendment that changed the way we appoint state judges, maybe give the legal profession a little bit more say-so in selecting nominees and trying to contrive a way of getting some of the partisanship and localism out. I think I don't know how you would do that. I mean, there are lots of ways that states appoint judges. Some of them have run for election, just like running for the city council. Some of them have the governor appoint the judges. Some of them have worked like this again in the United States, where the governor would appoint a judge or nominate a judge, and then the Senate or the General Assembly would confirm it. Those are still political processes. I prefer getting the politics out of the selection of judges as much as possible, but nobody knows really how to do it. So that's a structural change that I think is highly worth considering.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
My pleasure.
Before we close out, was there any other statements that you'd like to give?
Well, I've probably talked more than the audience wants to hear already.
Well, in that case, thank you so much for your assistance.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for asking me.